This is lecture number 6 in the International Human Rights class. I'm going to call it Camelot, Robin Hood, and Human Rights Organizations. The language of human rights, to some degree, people will argue, emerged earlier than certainly the 20th century. It goes back to Magna Carta of 1215, when the nobles and barons forced King John to sign a document that made him, in many ways, have to come under the jurisdiction of law, and so he could not use unlimited power as a monarch to oppress other people. So it's one of the earlier documents of liberty and human rights, and it's seen as a launch point of human rights. I'll return to this in a few seconds, but as I said, I'm going to be reflecting on the stories of Camelot, or King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, fast forward to Robin Hood, and then fast forward even quicker to human rights organizations of today. These two stories hopefully will point the way in terms of approaching human rights in a situation where the state itself is a guarantee of rights. The 6 major rights I've mentioned previously: ecological rights and to some degree animal rights, and what happens when one is in a state where in fact it is a means of abusing rights, undermining rights. What do human rights people and organizations do in such a historic context? And in that sense, the Arthurian tradition and the Robin Hood tradition reflect these two very different approaches. So let me start with Camelot, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and then I'll move forward to the Robin Hood and his merry men and women, which occurred at the time of King John, and the Magna Carta, which is very significant for the whole Robin Hood myth and stories. It's contextualized with Magna Carta and what was going on there. So the King Arthur tradition, underneath it, without going into extensive detail on the story, is that Arthur himself emerges, period of Lagresse. It's a period of time when the Roman Empire is pulling out. The Saxons are coming in from the north and plundering. Violent people are being killed. Women are being raped. Families and villages are being destroyed. And it's at this period of time that Merlin, again the sage in most great myths, and the Lady of the Lake, key figure in all of this. The sword is put in the rock, and only the one who is called to lead a country in justice and peace will be able to pull the sword from it. And within the Arthurian tradition, Arthur is able to do this, and eventually at Camelot he brings round him many women and men, and the many stories of the reign of Lagresse, Camelot itself, which was the center of that. For a period of time, it brought justice, peace. It overcame violence in small communities where there were working class people who were not being paid well. They were being brutalized by other knights in various parts of Britain. The Knights of Camelot, adventure after adventure, they became the agents of bringing justice for a short period of time, and imperfect justice at that, within the era of Lagresse. This is a model, in a sense, without going into the multiple stories of Lancelot and Guinevere and Galahad and Lancelot and Sir Gawain and Tristan and Isolde, these many people which are part of that great story of the French-English Camelot tradition. But within this story itself is the notion that the state at its best, and in that Arthurian tradition, the state, through its various men and women who play significant roles, are the agents and the means of bringing about the best human rights. They wouldn't have used human rights at that point in history, but they would use the language of justice and overcoming injustices. But the state was the means in Lagresse at its best period of time, in which the role of the leadership in the state and people. So society and the state, in that sense, came together to create the good, the just, the meaningful kingdom. Now, it was a short period of time, as I said, between the Roman Empire pulling out and the Saxons coming in. But this period of time is remembered significantly within the English tradition. There's also the French elements of this as well, as a period of history in which a model of the good state existed. Now, fast forward this, as I mentioned, Magna Carta was signed in 1215 by King John. At this period of time, the Crusades were going on, and Richard the Lionhearted, who was in principle the King of England at the time, had left on the Crusades, leaving in the Crusades the regent, the one who played the role of the monarch at that period of time, or the regent. He remained behind, but he was an unjust ruler. He taxed people heavily. He was an agent of injustice. The Sheriff of Nottingham followed the lead of John. Guy of Gisborne, Sir Guy of Gisborne, similar to the Sheriff of Nottingham. This was a period of time in which injustice flourished. The peasants, the working class people, the middle class people, even many of the barons were taken advantage of. And so here you have a situation in which the state is not the agent of justice in any minimal way. So what do people do who see that justice and peacemaking and overcoming the misuse of power to take advantage of people? How are they to respond? Now, the Robin Hood and his merry men story, again, is set within the period of Magna Carta. They both came from Maid Marian, interesting, a very feisty, very gifted woman. She could shoot arrows as perfectly as could Robin Hood and merry men. She could go toe to toe for them on anything. They both came from aristocratic families, but they saw the leadership at that time when Richard the Lionhearted was gone, and the state was an unjust state. In terms of how were they then to guarantee and ensure minimal rights for peasants and working class people? Well, they then became the outlaws. They then had to be agents of guaranteeing rights independent of the state, because the state itself was the means, through the misuse of power, of oppressing people. And the Robin Hood tradition very much saw themselves, the whole myth is in the line and lineage of the King Arthur tradition. And this is a case where the state, unlike the Arthurian tradition, has become an agent of oppressing people rather than an agent of liberating people. So the agents at this point of justice and peace became outlaws, and so the Robin Hood tradition is one of the state rather than an agent of justice and human rights, as the state is an agent of unjust activities and the oppression of human rights activists, if we can put it that way. And so Robin Hood and the merry men and women of Sherwood Forest and other places where they were hunted down constantly by the police, by the military, by those in power who are abusing the power given to them by Richard the Lionhearted. And so here we have two models: the Arthurian tradition, in which the state is an agent of justice and peace; the Robin Hood tradition, in which it's an agent of unjust or injustice. So what do human rights organizations, if I can fast forward that, how do they operate in conditions where a state is minimally concerned with human rights, or even in a more significant way concerned with human rights? They're given obviously much more freedom and support in their work, either working with the state or working alongside of the state through non-government organizations, intergovernment organizations, government-assisted organizations. So intergovernment organizations like the United Nations, obviously with its multiple branch organizations for economic and social cultural rights, its political, social, its cultural rights, its legal rights, civil rights, within a world order in which these rights are respected, and there's organizations which embody them. In that sense, they're drawing from the older Arthurian tradition. So in liberal democratic states, the state does play a role in principle of guaranteeing certain political, civil, legal rights. And in the best of liberal democratic traditions of social, economic, cultural rights, environmental rights, and within that framework itself, what you have is the means, imperfectly so and always imperfectly so, of guaranteeing rights, and particularly where there's been historical oppressions of people, First Nations people, working class people, immigrants, refugees. It is the role of the state within that Arthurian tradition to further rights in terms of protecting people. And so within this tradition where you have, or even non-government groups, say ecological issues, Greenpeace, or human rights issues such as Amnesty International, or aid and development groups like Oxfam or World Vision or Mennonite Central Committee, there's multiple organizations which are either non-government, and non-government essentially mean those which are not funded by the government, or government-assisted organizations, which often claim to be non-government, but in fact it's usually 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 funding by the government. But within these traditions, you have the state at an international level. You have major international organizations concerned with rights. And then you also have the, as I was mentioning, non-government organizations, government-assisted and intergovernment organizations that are central to upholding these major areas of rights. But what happens in states following the Robin Hood tradition, which in fact the Richard the Lionhearted, mythically anyway, which was about a just state, is gone. And the state is an agent of either chaos or oppressing or minimizing or undermining or subordinating human rights. We can see states in chaos today, such as Syria, certainly with the Arab Spring of 2011. Fast forward, Syria has been the worst in terms of multiple human rights violations and the chaos and the tragedies that have ensued there. Russia these days, just the other day, the major opponent of Putin, it's believed he was poisoned. He went to Germany, Navalny. He returned just this weekend. Thousands of protesters have turned up in Russia to protest against Putin and his authoritarian leadership. This is sort of, Navalny in that sense would be embody the Robin Hood tradition within the Russian context, of which Putin in some ways would be the Sheriff of Nottingham story. We can look at, certainly in the news the last few weeks, much less a few years, Myanmar, formerly Burma, Buddhist state in this sense, oppressing the Rohingya Muslims in what's been called ethnocide. Our Canadian ambassador to the UN, Bob Ray, has at the UN and other places in world opinion has really focused on Myanmar and the treatment of the Rohingya Muslims. What does one do in a state? And we could go in other places of the world. Obviously, I mentioned previously China. We could look at Saudi Arabia, treatment in Yemen, Iran, various states in Africa. You could move around the world in this sense. But what happens when a state itself is an agent of oppressing their own citizens, either forcing them out of the country or through police and death squads, dealing with anyone who dares to protest, what is the role then of human rights organizations? Because they're not seen as legitimate purveyors of human rights. They themselves are threats to the state. They're threats to the Sheriff of Nottingham. They're threats to King John. They're threats to Guy of Gisborne. They're seen as outlaws, just as Robin Hood, Maid Marian, and the merry men of the Robin Hood tradition are. And so these non-government groups, these government-assisted groups, these intergovernment groups, what's then the role of human rights organizations as they engage these states, which themselves are undermining basic international standards, whether the Declaration of Human Rights, covenants of torture and genocide, covenants on political, civil, legal rights, economic, social, ecological rights, First Nations rights, animal rights. How do organizations like that within the states which are oppressing them, which they're usually seen as outlaws or dissidents, and they often disappear, and then the organization outside of those states, what is their role in putting pressure on these particular states, which essentially are dominated by unjust and oppressive leadership? So the major human rights organizations in the world today, whether they're environmental organizations, particularly when we think of the Amazon, treatment of people and the forests in the Amazon and Brazil, the human rights situations in various Latin American countries, major regions of the world where these rights are being abused. How do human rights organizations operate when, in fact, the Robin Hood model dominates rather than the Arthurian tradition operates? So this is where it's important for international organizations to be engaged in states where the John, Guy of Gisborne, Sheriff of Nottingham runs the day to protect the human rights activists within these states so they can continue their work. Hence the role of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many other organizations as well. So two models to reflect on in terms of human rights organizations. The model of a state which imperfectly, because all states always imperfectly embody rights, no state is going to perfectly embody rights, but at least within the Arthurian model, the state in principle is meant to protect, ensure, guarantee basic human rights are protected. Within the alternate vision of the state, in which the John, Guy of Gisborne, Sheriff of Nottingham, how then do human rights activists operate? And this is the desperate need of the international community in playing a significant role in defending those within states, which are they are often seen then as the outlaws. They're outside the law and the law itself is oppressive. And so it's the tension between really what we would call natural law and positive law. It goes back really to the old Antigone tradition, in which Antigone stood for a moral law versus the law of Creon, which we create this law for order and stability, but the order and stability is unjust. And so Antigone, in the tragedy of Antigone, in that sense, who was in her time, a human rights defender of a higher moral law against human created law. So two models, the Arthurian tradition, the Robin Hood tradition. Fast forward to the situation today of human rights violations in different parts of the world, and how do human rights organizations operate in these two very different models in terms of a state pro-human rights and a state contra human rights and the implications of it.